What would the world look like if people felt like they mattered? Welcome to the Lead with Love podcast, exploring what it means to lead with love in business and life. I'm your host, Jada Selner, and in this show, I'll share meaningful conversations to help you, the creative, the entrepreneur, the world changer, reach more people, go after your dreams, and serve your community with love. I appreciate you joining me. Now let's get cozy and start today's episode. If you've ever found yourself pursuing the unconventional path in life, this episode is for you. You're listening to episode 116 of the Lead with Love podcast, and in today's conversation, I talk with Chris Guillebeau, the New York Times bestselling author of The $100 Startup. And this is one of my favorite books, one of the most instrumental books that I used during my launch of Simple Green Smoothies. And I've used those skill sets and things that I've learned along the way in building an unconventional business online. He's also written Side Hustle and many, many other books. I actually learned he's written 5 books. For some reason, I thought it was 4, but he is a book writing machine, which he'll talk about in today's episode. And during a lifetime of self-employment for Chris, that included a 4-year commitment as a volunteer executive in West Africa. And he has visited every country in the world. That is 193 countries total before his 35th birthday. His daily podcast, Side Hustle School, is downloaded more than 2 million times a month. Hashtag podcast goals. So some things we talk about in today's episode are how to build a community from scratch, what Chris does to stop comparing himself to others, and he admits that this is an ongoing process, and balancing criticism and connection, and why not everything you write has to land with everyone. This is such a good reminder for me to personally hear. And Chris also shares what his team looks like today. You know, we talk about scale and business and why he's unconventional in this approach with his business and his team, and the path to take if you want to speak at an event like World Domination Summit, which I got to speak at in 2014. And he also shares the one thing you should never ask when it comes to wanting to speak on big stages. So let's get cozy in today's episode. Hi, Chris.
Hi. How are you doing?
Good. It's so good to connect with you, hear your voice live, because I've been, listening to your newest podcast, Side Hustle School. And I know we were just talking about how, you've been recording daily, 5 to 6 days a week, which is amazing. And I really just want to let people know how we first connected. I actually, when I got into the online space in 2011, I heard about, where all the cool kids hang out if you're an entrepreneur or wanting to change the world, that you go to World Domination Summit, which is WDS. And I remember just reading the event page and just feeling, oh my gosh, this event sounds amazing. This sounds like my people. And I planted this seed of, I want to speak there one day. And it was just a seed planted. I'm
so glad you did.
Yeah. And there was nothing, I worked with Jonathan Fields, and I remember getting this email from him, and it was like, would you like to speak at WDS? And I was like, HE double hockey stick. Yes. Right. And he made that intro for us to connect. And I don't know if you know, but me speaking on the WDS stage was the very first keynote I've ever done. So,
oh, wow. No, I didn't do that.
Just speaking in front of 3,000 people for the first keynote, No
big deal.
Yeah, no big deal. So it was such an amazing opportunity for me. It was actually a big coming out party of telling my story, Simple Green Smoothies, and even beyond that of how I got to where I am today. So I just want to thank you for that beautiful opportunity to share my message, to share my story on the WDS stage.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. The honor was all ours. And as you know, the community loved you. Yeah. And you brought so much to that event, and not just that year, but I think in years forward, people continue to refer to it and think back upon it as a highlight. So I'm so glad that you said yes.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. So, I always like to lead with a pretty big question, which is, what does leading with love mean to you? And how do you put love into practice in your business?
Wow, what a great question. That is a big question to lead with. So let's see, leading with love, and how do I put love into my business? I guess for better or worse, I always thought of my life and my business as being somewhat integrated. And I didn't do things the way that a lot of other people did, which is not really meant to be like an implicit criticism of what other people did. I just didn't quite know, like the other way that people were doing things. And so throughout my life, that kind of followed me, and that helped me to develop this whole thread of nonconformity, which is how I started my blog, like The Art of Nonconformity. And then that led to WDS and a lot of other things since then. And so if I look back over the past few years, I can see some things I did well and some things I didn't do well. I think the through line is, being somewhat intentional and maybe placing some different values on things. And so when I say that, I don't mean to say that I didn't have a value of making money, because I think, making money for the most part is a fundamentally good thing. And on the podcast Side Hustle School, I'm trying to help people, create a new source of income, without quitting their job and all that kind of stuff. But I guess what I'm saying is, leading with love is a great phrase, because I often thought of the success of my business or of my life, or I don't know, whatever profile I was trying to build or impact I was supposed to have, based not so much on the money that was coming in, but rather on the connection or the depth of it, or the experience that people were having in response to what I was writing or sharing, or as I was pursuing my own quest to go to every country in the world, that kind of thing. So I guess I just had some different motivations. And for me, at least, I found those motivations to be even more powerful than I think what a lot of people think about when they think about business. And again, I love business, so it's kind of a complicated thing. It's not like I'm an anti-capitalist in any way, but I think there's certainly room for, and even a necessity for, looking at different kinds of metrics, aside from how many sales or how many customers do I have or whatever. It's more okay, what am I really doing here? And with the knowledge that life is short and one day it's going to end, what do I ultimately hope to leave behind? And so maybe that awareness as well, being part of it.
I love that you said that, your intention was that business and life is integrated. And so we really can't separate the two. Right. It's an intention. Right. And if we are loving in our own personal lives, that we bring that love into our business lives as well. And that there are more metrics, not to say that money is not an important metric when you're building a business, but there are those intangible ones that matter even more.
Mm-hmm. And I think, integrated, that word is good, integration and alignment. I tend to use words like that more than a concept of balance, because I feel like when people say balance, again, maybe it's a little bit of semantics, but I think they're looking for a formula. They're looking for oh, this is my life work balance. If I get, this percentage right here and this percentage right here, then that's what I'm kind of looking for. And I think it's more rather than trying to compartmentalize so much, what are your overall values? What do you hope to achieve in life? And who do you hope to become? And, all that kind of stuff. And then everything flows from there. And if you get that stuff right, then it's not so much a matter of finding the right formula, but just living the life that you have, set out for yourself.
Is there, that more love-based metric that, you mentioned connection, what people, the value they're receiving, the experience they're getting? Is there a specific moment or story that you can remember where you really felt filled up by something like that?
Yeah, it's also a good question. I guess I'm trying to make it personal and individual. I guess if I think about when I started pretty early on, I started writing about travel, and I was writing some, pretty rudimentary kind of stuff, nothing groundbreaking, I thought. But then I realized as people would, I would get emails from people, or I would host a meetup. And the first few times I did that, I realized that the people who were coming, they were connecting on a much deeper level. And so I started paying a lot more attention to that. And so now I find a lot of value. I used to joke that I get paid in nice emails, and I still feel that way in lots of ways. I still have a little bit of an Evernote file that I keep, certain notes from people when they kind of write in and say here's what I'm doing in my life, and I found your book or whatever, and this kind of helped me in some way. And obviously that person is doing all the work themselves, and I don't see what I do as being a catalyst for them, but the fact that there's some connection is very meaningful to me. So, pretty much on a regular basis, and I'm sure you get lots of communication like this too, just hearing about this convergence between something I've done and what other people are doing, that to me is is motivating. You know, while we're talking as well, I was thinking about this. I don't know if you know Tim Sanders, but he had a great book title a few years ago called Love is the Killer App. I thought it was just such a great title. I was like, wow, that's a beautiful book title. Like, because everybody's talking about what's the killer app? Well, love is the killer app. You know, like this is the secret to, you know, so many things. And it's not a secret that you can just, you know, write down and say, go out and love, you know, but there is so much to it.
Oh, yes. I love that. And I have to also let you know, so there was WDS, but I actually have $100 startup with me right now. And it was my Bible for doing our launch where Jen and I, we did our first launch. It was $86,000 in 10 days. And I literally like the launch checklist, the, you know, treat it like a movie trailer, all of those things. So your books do impact. They do change people's lives. And I was just looking at all the pages of how many earmarks and underlines I have. And it's definitely one of the 3 most pivotal books that I've read in my business building journey. So,
thank you for saying that. That's very kind of you. That's very nice. And I think of it like I have a couple of friends. This is something I've thought about from time to time too, because I have some friends who, you know, kind of started around the same time as me, and they went a little bit different direction. They focused a lot more on building their business and truly like, you know, creating scale and systems. And like they've gone on to do like fabulously, phenomenally well. And there are times when I feel a little bit envious or a little bit like, I mean, like obviously I'm doing well too. And I feel very fortunate and grateful. But sometimes I'm like, oh, I wish I had like focused more on like building the sales funnel and, you know, all this kind of stuff. But I really did choose to like focus on writing books and even going down like, you know, a relatively traditional path in terms of publishing, which is odd since, you know, it's like the whole art of nonconformity and unconventional.
Totally.
I know it's weird, but it worked for me. It was like what I felt like I was supposed to do basically. And it's like, I look back and I'm like, okay, in some ways, you know, it would be great, you know, if I made like 8 figures or whatever, like some of these guys do, but you know, like I have everything that I need. And like, I feel like what I'm doing matters to the right people. And so that's great. So again, thank you for saying that.
Yeah. And isn't that fascinating how even when we are doing well and we have enough, we like our needs are met, we're making meaningful change in the world. And yet there is always more that we could reach or strive for. And it's, what do you do to kind of take yourself off the peanut butter and jelly train?
What's it called? The peanut butter and jelly train?
Yes.
I've never heard that before.
I always say like, I'm peanut butter and jelly. Like if I'm jealous about something, I'm like,
that's funny. That's great. I never heard that expression. Well, it's interesting because I think it's a complex thing because I think the first phrase you used was something like, you know, no matter like what we do, there's always something that we have to reach toward. I think that's very healthy. I think that's very healthy to you should always have another goal. Like once you achieve something, it's like, great. Okay. Well, now the stakes are raised. Like now you've had this experience. What's next? You know, you don't want to live in your, you know, current state. You don't want to live in your, like, you know, your past goal or whatever. So I guess I'm always trying to challenge myself, but the other part is, you know, unhealthy, you know, what you're talking about in terms of the comparison of like, oh, I wish, you know, could have been this person or they did this right. Or they just, you know, maybe they even got lucky or something. I don't know. It's like, I think it's a very unhealthy thing. And I don't really have the answer. It's one of those things like people are always like, how do you deal with people, you know, with like your online haters or whatever, and people like give advice or whatever. And it all sounds great. But then the next time you deal with that situation, you still feel pretty bad or whatever. Yeah. So I think I would be disingenuous if I said like, here's the way to like handle comparison, because it's something that still kind of pokes at me sometimes.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate your transparency in that. And, you know, you wrote a post actually at the beginning of this year and the importance of having a breakdown, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And I'm so curious what inspired you to share that, to be so vulnerable. And I know you're talking about anxiety and sadness and just the discomfort of sitting in the unknown.
Yeah, I mean, that's a long story. I guess the short version is I was just having a pretty hard time. And, you know, I have struggled with depression and anxiety over the past, 5 years or so. And I've written about it, you know, from time to time on my blog, whenever it seems right to do so. And so I was going through just a particularly difficult period. It's kind of those things where like one thing you should never say in life is like, it could never get worse, you know, because like if you're in a bad period or something, oh, well, at least it can never get worse. It can always get worse, you know?
Yeah.
And I guess I just kind of reached a point where I was like, okay, I have to make some changes. I have to do something different in my life, because what I feel like I'm doing is not really working for me. And the things that I think I said something about the things that brought me joy before no longer brought me joy. And so I don't know, it's a complex thing. I mean, I started going to therapy, I started taking some medication, just doing stuff to just look after, myself and my wellness a little bit. And so I think I'm coming out of it. I think I'm doing much better this spring. I don't, at least when we're talking, it's spring.
Yeah.
I never want to, right, you might be listening to this later, but I never want to say like, oh, everything's great, but because these things are like a cycle and a pendulum, but I just tried to pay more attention and, just get more specific about what I needed to do for myself so that I could do a better job in my work for other people.
And do you feel, when you are more vulnerable, and I'm sure there's some vulnerability hangovers, that like, how do you feel on the other side of pressing publish to be super honest and transparent with your community in that way?
I mean, I can say it's only been positive, like for the most part, like it's a good thing. I mean, some people obviously don't care about that kind of content because they just want to learn about their $100 startup or their travel hacking, and that's fine. That's okay. That's totally fine. But I think it connects with certain people, who are struggling, in a different way and maybe aren't used to, reading something like that or hearing something, in this way. So I hear from those people a lot whenever I do that. Or like a few years ago, I started writing about ADD. And I made the decision to start taking medication for that, which I was at the time, I think 36 or 37 years old. And I had never taken medication as an adult. I was always kind of opposed to it. But again, it was a similar situation where I got to the point where I'm like, okay, something's not working. I need to be open to stuff. I need to try, things and at least see, how I respond to it or whatever. And so I wrote about that, and I went into like all the details of it, and like, here's why I didn't like to take medication before. And here's my experiment. I tried it, and obviously talk to your doctor, et cetera, et cetera. But that, I mean, like I still get a lot of emails from people, who are like, oh, I'm also, adult ADD, and felt like people didn't really understand me. And I, was afraid of taking medication for the same reasons that you were, but now like I've gone to talk to my doctor. So anyway, this is like a long story, but the point is I feel like it connects with the right people in the right way. And for everybody else, it's not like they have a negative reaction. They just don't care, which is life.
I think that's such a good reminder too, as we are, putting our work out in the world, we're sharing our stories, our messages, that not every blog post or podcast has to land with everybody. Like it's like, oh, if a handful of people, even if one person's life is changed in listening to this, it's like, we don't have to, I struggle with this of like the people pleasing of like, I need everybody to be happy all the time. So I think that's just a good reminder that, you're going to make and share parts of your life and story and know that it's not going to land with everyone. And they're just going to be like, okay, good. Like, I can't wait for that next one that comes out, Yeah.
And like, speaking of correlations or connections, like you asked, like, what's the connection between like sharing these, vulnerable things and how people respond? You could almost like look at it the opposite way. And I think at different times in my writing career, I've maybe tried to, I don't want to say I've tried to be someone I'm not, I don't think I've done that, but I think I have tried to be more conscious of like, I don't know, quote unquote, writing for a mainstream audience or whatever, or just like, again, I don't want to say dumbing it down, but I do think there are clear times when I've been maybe less on point or more just general and less specific. And those are the times in which people respond a lot less, basically. And like, people just don't, I noticed if I went through a long period where I didn't get a lot of criticism, and at first it was like, well, that's great. But then after a while, I'm like, is anybody actually paying attention? Right? Because if nobody's offended, like, or nobody has a strong reaction, then am I really writing anything of significance,
Yeah, I love that. Just like the visual that comes up for me is this spectrum of criticism and connection. Like you're going to receive both. And if you're in the middle, it's kind of like meh.
Right. It means nobody cares. That's a bad place to be.
Yeah.
Right. Like your enemy is like, I remember this quote from Seth Godin a long time ago, and this was in the context of like online piracy, and she's like, aren't you worried about your books being stolen or whatever? He's like, your enemy as an author is not piracy, it's obscurity. Basically, like the thing you should be worried about is nobody caring. In other words, that is the greatest challenge people face, which is what I always say when people are like, oh, like I'm worried about someone stealing my idea. If I tell somebody my business idea, I'm like, nobody's going to care. Basically, like nobody's going to steal your idea because, ideas don't have value until you do something with them. But the greater thing you need to worry about is that nobody's going to actually do something about the thing that you create. So that's what you need to worry about.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier about, kind of hosting your first few meetups. And I'm actually curious about the very first meetup and like what that was like and how many people came.
Yeah, let's see. I think there are two that run together. They were very close back to back. One was in Portland and one was in New York City. And I think we talked about Jonathan Fields, or you mentioned Jonathan. Actually, that one in New York was with him. We did it together. And I mean, there were like, I don't know, 40 people or something that came. And like, that was, I don't know, I was expecting like 5 people to come. And it was just so cool because they all had stories of like what they were doing and like what they were trying to do and a trip they were trying to take or their corporate job and what they were, trying to build for themselves on the side. And it was just really, really interesting. And then same kind of thing in Portland. I think it was about that many people, 40 or 50. And I just went away just feeling really like buzzed, feeling really like, wow, there's some potential here. There's some energy here. And I don't quite know what to do with it. I don't know if there is something that, like, I don't know how you like harness this, but it is really interesting that, all these people came out. I remember actually not being sure like how to facilitate that. Like, is it a workshop? Well, not really. I don't have anything to say. They all want to talk to me, but obviously I can't talk to everybody at once. So there's probably power in connecting them, to one another, but how do I actually do that? And obviously a lot of it happens organically, but, still just trying to figure out, okay, what's the next step? What do we do with this? But I went away feeling really inspired.
And so I'm curious for you, World Domination Summit now, you reached over 10,000 people, people from 40 different countries. And what was the seed that was planted to, really get that off the ground?
It was those meetups, like not necessarily those two, but just meetups in general. And realizing that there were all these, really interesting people out there who were kind of organizing in a way that was a bit different. They weren't organizing around a demographic. It was much more like a psychographic in terms of like, I want to live my life unconventionally. Well, how does one connect with, people who want to do that? And especially if you're not in a place like Portland or San Francisco, if you're in the middle of the country or if you're in some other country, if you feel a little bit isolated, in some ways it was more interesting to do meetups, in Kansas or wherever, and then think, okay, how can we bring like people, how can we connect people from all different walks of life in one spot? And then there was that whole issue of like, okay, like it can't be completely organic. Like there has to be some structure to this. Like, I don't want to just have an unconference and like throw 1,000 people together, because that works for some people, but obviously a lot of people it doesn't, like a lot of people just get lost or they're more introverted or sensitive. And so what do you have to like actually plan something. And I also believe in like putting forward a message and agenda and like challenging people a bit. So that was that. And we obviously didn't know like what we were doing, like myself and the like small team that put it together, but kind of, figured it out. And after the first year of doing it, we had learned a lot more about event planning and all that kind of stuff that we knew nothing about beforehand, and just kind of went from there. Like, I believe if you have the people, you can figure everything else out, basically. Like if you have, a demand for something or an interest, or like people are looking to you for leadership or for guidance or for something, then all other things are possible, basically. But if you start the opposite way, if you're the world's best event planner in the world, but you don't have a community, like, what are you going to do? So it's much, much better to be in that other position. Right.
So what would be your recommendations now, especially as the online world has changed and shifted? How does someone, build their community, or what would you recommend if you had to build a community from scratch today? Sure. What would you do?
Sure. I mean, I think, I think what's changed is a lot of tactics. I don't know that the broad strategy has shifted. I think more than ever, the message is the most important thing, and having a clear message and being really clear about what you stand for and what it's about, because there is a great saturation of people sharing similar messages, and that's good in a lot of ways. But, the corollary is it's hard to stand out. So maybe taking the time to just get really intentional about what is it that you hope, like, what is the change that you wish to see in the world? To go back to that old quote, like, you want to change the world, how? Like, if you can only fix one problem in the world of all the problems out there, like we all are aware of, so many things that are wrong or so many things that we'd like to fix. Well, if you could only fix one thing, what would that be? And what is your message for us? And like, I think that's a process that doesn't necessarily need to be fast tracked. And I'm like, obviously all about like getting started quickly, and like side hustle school is like start your business in 27 days and stuff. But I think it's, what are you really trying to achieve? Okay, if you want to just have an income generating project, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Like, there's a way to do that. If it is like a little bit more personality based, or you are trying to like be a public figure of some kind, then I think that there's value in, if you're not really clear what it is that you want to communicate and share, maybe working on that first, because the tactics are always going to change. Like every social network is going to come and go, every medium is going to come and go. or evolve at least. But having the message is not. Like when I started, I probably spent at least 6 months like writing posts for my blog that were never published. And it was just like trying to write this draft content and figure out, okay, what is the message of Art of Nonconformity? And it was still kind of wasn't really well articulated, I think, when it first came out. But the 6 months were still good for me. Like they were still good in helping like kind of, get comfortable with the practice of it and figuring out who am I writing for and all that kind of stuff. So I think message is far more important than anything else.
Yeah. And I love, the underlying message of knowing your message is that it takes time to build a community. It's not a quick, like one night stand and like rush through that process. So I really love that perspective. And are there certain shifts that you've made online now to nurture your community with the changes, the online scape?
Yeah, let's see, a few different things. And I have a long way to go. Like I'm constantly thinking of all the different stuff I should be doing and not. I'm really, you've always been so much better at social media than me. And podcasting, one for sure. Podcasting is definitely a thing like that I've been really surprised by. If you had asked me, in fact, I think I said, like I was quoted somewhere like 3 years ago saying like, podcasting is kind of on the way out. It was like, it was like a trend and like, who wants to listen to podcasts? Like obviously that's a terrible thing, to have like in the public record. But I started the podcast. I was really surprised. It brought me a whole new audience. And Gretchen Rubin said that to me when she started hers. And like Gretchen has like tremendous profile and like millions of books sold all over the world. And she said when she started her podcast, it really was like a whole new thing. So I'm really glad that I did that. Otherwise, I think I'm kind of in the midst of regrouping now. Like I don't think at the time we're talking, I'm not doing a very good job with my blog and it bothers me. It's bothered me for a while. And I think I kind of know what the answer is, but I also don't quite know how to make it happen in terms of my capacity and limitations and all the other stuff that I'm doing. So that's something that I'm struggling with and trying to overcome. Basically, I want to write in a different way with a little bit of a different voice. And so it's kind of like, how do I go from where I am now to where I want to be? So I've got some work to do.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that too, because I'm sure people look at like someone for you have four published books, right? Am I missing any?
5 now, but that's okay.
5. Oh my goodness. It's amazing. Okay. 5 published books. If someone looks at you, they think like he has it all together. He's consistently blogging, that type of thing. And it's like, we have those ebbs and flows in our businesses of where we're showing up consistently. And you're obviously showing up consistently with the podcast because you're recording episodes 5 to 6 days a week, which is amazing. And what was the part about podcasting that did surprise you? Because you said
what was it that surprised me? Yeah, well, I think the couple of things. The audience response for sure surprised me. I didn't understand. Like I had seen the numbers before, but I didn't really understand how many people consume this medium as their primary medium, and really are auditory learners. So just the commitment and the loyalty to that. I have so many people that started on day one. So you mentioned I record 5 to 6 days a week. Well, the show comes out every single day, 7 days a week. I haven't missed a day. First year, 2017 with 365 episodes, and same thing for year number 2, like 7 days a week. So that consistency has been really, really good. Like when I decided to start that, it was not something that a lot of other people necessarily understood. Like even the podcast network that I'm working with, they were kind of like, wow, you want to do this every day of the week, like 5 days a week, And I was like, well, 7 actually, because 7 days a week, But there've been a lot of people that have listened from episode 1, like all the way through. And there are people that discover it later and they go back and binge listen through the entire catalog. And I'm like, how do you do that? Like, that's just amazing. But the people really, really are kind of committed to that. So that's been surprising. But the reason why I mentioned the daily thing is, for me, it's actually been much easier to do it every day than it would be to do it twice a week or 3 times a week or whatever. Like, I'm absolutely convinced of that. Just having the routine and the habit of like the deliverable, like every single day, doesn't matter what else I'm doing. I can be anywhere in the world, and I'm still traveling a lot, doing a lot of other stuff. But no matter what other commitment I have going on, no matter how I feel or whatever, like this has to happen. And that's actually been really good.
Did you have any fears, hesitations, or doubts in launching the podcast before it actually?
The biggest one for sure was because the whole format of the show, for those who aren't familiar, like I don't do interviews. It's just me. It's 10 minutes a day, and every single day I'm telling a story, a different true story of somebody who has a job and starts a side hustle. It starts like this income generating project, not just a part-time job or whatever, but actually like create some kind of asset for themselves. And so I deconstruct it and do a little case study model and talk about how much money they make and all that. So my biggest fear was like, where am I going to get all these stories from? Right. Because if I promised people, every single day in 2017, I mean, when we launched, I think I had the first, 10 episodes recorded, and I maybe had the next 20 identified, but we're talking like I had 30 out of 365, kind of identified. And my hope, of course, was that like the show is going to kind of carry itself and sustain itself. And, a lot of people who listen are going to refer people, and, eventually people will actually be starting projects or listeners, and we'll feature those. But I had no idea like if it would actually happen. So I was really worried about that. Yeah.
Totally. Just making the promise up front.
Yep.
I'm like, I've got 10 recorded.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Oh, I love that. So, I'm curious from a storytelling, has there been anything that you've done to kind of deepen your learning and becoming a better storyteller, especially being able to tell a story in 10 minutes?
Mm-hmm. I mean, you can do a lot in 10 minutes though. 10 minutes is long.
Yeah.
I think 2 to 3 minutes is long. Like for WDS or other events, we sometimes have like little short things where people get to share a story in 2 minutes. And, at first they're always like, 2 minutes, how am I going to do that? I'm like, if you script it, if you really get specific about what you want to communicate, you can do a lot in 2 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it is, And it's harder, actually. It's harder to do it in a short period of time than just like, oh, take all the time you want,
Yeah.
Then you're just going to ramble and go off on lots of tangents. Yeah, I don't know. I forget exactly what you asked about storytelling.
Yeah, or I'm just curious if you read any books or anything you're just...
I probably should have.
And is there a framework or an outline or structure that you create for yourself to tell these stories?
A little bit. I mean, I have a wonderful assistant who works with me and works with all the people that we're featuring. And so she's really good at kind of creating a calendar and looking ahead of like, okay, this is coming up. This is what's ahead. I do want to get more thematic with it. I mean, that was one of my intentions was like, okay, in January, we're talking about this, in February, this, and so on. But just in the kind of getting into like the throes of it, of like, oh, every day there has to be a story, I didn't necessarily continue that thematic emphasis. So I still want to get better about that. But yeah, there's like a general flow and a general structure of like, I am trying to teach through storytelling, but I want the stories themselves to be fun and interesting. And even if you have no desire to do what this particular person that I'm telling you about is doing, it's still something that you could, enjoy listening to for a short period of time. And I guess the other fear was like, okay, even if I can find enough stories, I'm worried that so many of them are going to be the same, and like there are similarities, but, for the most part, I'm not featuring, a lot of like business strategists or life coaches, or like it's people that are doing really unusual and unconventional, interesting sorts of things. And so the diversity of it helps quite a bit. And I think that's something that has served it well.
Yeah, I love that. I also love that you mentioned, you have this intention or this vision to theme it out, but you're not implementing it right now.
Yeah, correct. I have a vision to do a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Got a long list of things that, should be happening and,
Yeah, but I think it's important for people to hear because they want to get the vision fully implemented out the first gate, and it's just like, it actually takes time to build and add in all of those layers. And that's what I think is so beautiful about you being able to go deep. And you're like, hey, I'm ready for year 2, 2018. Let's do it again. And then you can, maybe 2019 is when the themes come out,
We'll see.
Totally. So being a traditionally published author and unconventional catalyst,
right.
I'm curious, what's been surprising to you being a published author?
How much I love it and how great I think it is and how surprised I always am when people who maybe don't like that system or like they choose to go outside it, which is totally fine. It's a completely viable path and a good choice for lots of people. But I'm surprised at just how critical they are of a system that I don't think they understand well, or they haven't used well, or they haven't learned to navigate well. And so they just kind of maybe throw it out, whereas for me, like it's been so great for all kinds of reasons. Like one of the questions people ask is like, has your editor like censored you? basically. Like, do they tell you what to say or like prevent you from saying certain things? I'm like, you don't understand. Like, they've made the books better, right? It's the opposite, right? Like, I have really benefited from critical feedback and from them saying, actually, Chris, like, you got the right vision here, but this doesn't make any sense. And you're not really helping people with this story, and like just really critical stuff. It's been really good. So there's that, and then on the business side, yes, I know how to self-publish. Like, I realize there's a path for that, but one thing that's really great is my books are in a lot of different languages in a lot of different countries around the world. And there's sort of a path for that. So like if you're doing it completely on your own, but it's a lot harder. And I'm really grateful for the emails I get from Vietnam and from Japan and from, just all kinds of different places of people who found my books that they wouldn't have found them through any other approach or path. And so that and many other things are valuable to me.
I love that. Is there a specific ritual for you in writing the books that stayed with you since the very beginning of writing?
I don't know if I have a ritual. It's more kind of motivated by deadlines and goals. And maybe that's another thing. It's like working with a partner, which is what I do with the podcast as well. It creates accountability. And that's good for me. Like to the publishing stuff, like pretty much every book I've had that's come out, if it were up to me, I would have pushed the release date back. If it were up to me, I'd be like, I'm not ready. Actually, let's do this, 2 weeks later. But you can't do that, when you're working with a publishing partner and they have lots of people on their end and like lots of plans and stuff has been planned around you. So you have to make that deadline. So that's been like that, just having that accountability and like not wanting to let other people down has been, positive. I don't know if I have a writing ritual. It's just more like,
deadlines.
Yeah, exactly. So I break things down and like how many chapters, how many words, blah, 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 okay. Here's the time I need to work on my calendar for this and so on.
Yeah, no, I really love that. And there's a part that you've included in your book launches, which is actually having book tours and creating a live element. And it's something that you've even done with Side Hustle School as well. So it's not like just a one-time thing, like, I'm just going to do this. I'm just curious about what's been challenging and fun about making that a part of your book marketing strategy.
Yeah, well, it's been both. It has been challenging. It has been a lot of fun. It's probably more fun for sure. But the challenges are like, I don't want to do just like a 5-city tour. This all kind of goes back to like when the first book came out, the whole story about that, which is completely true, is like the book is coming out and like I talked to the publisher, and which I didn't have like a, great book deal or anything for my first book. And it was a small publisher. And I was like, hey guys, like I'm book's coming out in 2 months. Like, I'm ready to go on tour. Like, how does that work? And, they're like, we don't do that, basically. Like, nobody does that anymore. There's no money, et cetera. And they're like, you can come to New York and do something if you want. Maybe we'll pay for like one night at your hotel. It's like, okay, great. It's like my readers aren't just in New York or any one city. They're all over the place. And I've got this whole thing about how I'm going to every country in the world. So whatever I do has to be congruent with that. Yeah. And so I said, I'm going to go to all 50 states and every province in Canada. And so I did this thing called the Unconventional Book Tour, which I put together and, collectively organized with my readers for the most part. Like the publisher did help a little bit. They didn't pay for anything, but they did help with some of the logistics, which was great. And so doing that tour over the course of about 3 months, that was another kind of life-changing experience for me because I got to know all these different people, who had their own stories. And that led to the $100 startup. Half the stories in the $100 startup came from people that I met on that tour. And that also helped me like get a better publishing situation because the publishers were impressed that I was actually going to all 50 states on my own, to meet readers, right? And being willing to like go places that had 10 people or whatever. So since then, I've kind of carried it forward. Like I haven't done, all 50 states since then, but for Side Hustle, my most recent book, I think I did about 35, 40 cities. And I know, I love everything about it. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of logistics. It's obviously a sacrifice because if you do, whatever you do, you can't do something else. So, if I'm in such and such a place today, that means I'm saying no to something else. And there is a lot of time spent in transit, like lost time. But for me, I guess it's just part of the DNA of the whole operation, for better or worse. And it's something that I wouldn't want to stop.
Yeah. And it feels like it's also aligning with that, you're leading with love of that meaning and connection, which is because I know traveling, that's not inexpensive.
Right. It's not inexpensive. It has lots of costs, as you said, it's not just the financial costs, but other costs. And but it's been good. Like, I mean, I have no regrets about that. Like, I get tired by the end of it, but then I'm like looking forward to going. It's like anything in life, you know, you get tired of something and then you realize later, actually, that was a beautiful thing. Let's do it again, you know?
Yeah. So something that was really fascinating to me, you know, when I was at WDS was hearing you share your story about what you wanted to be when you grow up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's been a little while. Yeah, well, I think when I was, what did I say? Like when I was 6 years old, I wanted to work at Burger King. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes.
I thought Burger King was the coolest place. Like, you know, my parents were split up, so my dad would get me like for the weekend, and he's like, where do you want to go to eat? And I'm like, obviously, like, is there a choice? Like, of course it's going to be Burger King, you know? The only question was which one, because like, you know, one Burger King had the better onion rings and, you know, that kind of thing. And so I just thought like, that's like, you know, that's my dream job, basically. And then, you know, you get older and you realize that's actually not the greatest job in the world. And then I stopped eating at Burger King also, which was another good decision. But when I was 6, you know, that was the place to be.
Yeah. And do you feel that conversation of others, you know, when you were telling people, hey, I want to work at Burger King when I grow up?
Yeah. Well, I think that's funny is like, you know, even as kids, you're kind of socialized in a certain way. So like, you're not supposed to say that, right? And you kind of realize really quickly the reaction of adults around you is quite different than if you say you want to be the president or if you want to be an astronaut or, you know, whatever. It's like, you could do anything you want. I'm like, I want to go work at Burger King. They're like, okay, well, you know, it's also okay to change your mind.
Right.
You know, like if you change your mind later, Chris, that's all right. You know, like, oh, okay. So I guess I'm not supposed to say that.
Right. Yeah, I love that. And I think it's so interesting because, you know, with my daughter, you know, she's 10, almost 11 years old. And she's like, I'm not willing to choose right now. Like I like a lot.
Not to choose, right?
Yeah, I like a lot of things, and so I think there is a shift. I think you're definitely leading that way of living that unconventional life and being able to choose many paths along the way. So, was there ever a point, you know, when you were a kid writing, or when did that come for you? Of like, I want to be a writer, and then I want to be an author.
I don't think it was when I was a kid. I think as a young adult, I felt like I had something to share, but it took a little while to figure out what was the medium and how was I going to do it and all that. So most of my 20s were spent just having different experiences. And I, you know, worked for myself. I learned a lot about entrepreneurship and spent several years in West Africa as an aid worker. So that was a great experience as well. It was kind of coming out of all that. And then I went and did a master's degree program, and which is kind of useless, but that's another conversation. And in the midst of all that stuff, it was like, okay, what's next, basically? Because I do feel really fortunate to have had all these experiences and been to a lot of places, but there's not really much convergence or congruence between all of it. So I want to actually tie all that together somehow. And that's what led to, you know, the art of nonconformity when I turned 30. So basically from age 28 to age 30 is when I'm thinking about this a lot. You know, like I was doing other stuff. I was thinking like, okay, what is it that I'm going to make? And I knew I wanted to write, but I wasn't sure like what direction it would take and all that kind of stuff until later.
And do you have any recommendations for someone who, and I'm raising my hand too, I am a traditional published author, but I have another book baby in me of just like recommendations for people who are wanting to go down that path of being a traditionally published author. They want to be a speaker. They want to have, you know, those things. What would you tell them today?
Yeah. I mean, so again, start with something to say. Everything that I just mentioned earlier, I think is appropriate. And then, you know, try to get to know people. I mean, that's how I got to know all the different authors that I ended up connecting with. Go to events like WGS. Just seek out like-minded people, ask for advice. Most people are pretty approachable. You know, my experience, like pretty much, you know, anybody that I could track down and write to, there's 50% chance that person's going to actually write back. And in most cases, they're at least somewhat helpful. But then I guess like, you know, what we talked about earlier, just start sharing. I mean, you have to start somewhere. You have to start sharing something, right? So you don't go from just like not having anything to all of a sudden having the book deal or whatever the book deal or the pilot or whatever the medium is going to be. You have to kind of work through some stuff, and you can't really work through it completely on your own in your cave. Like after a while, it has to be shared, and then you kind of get a different experience. Like I saw with like the initial stuff I was sharing, and then I went out and did these meetups, and I was like, oh wow, it's totally different. Like it's so much more depth to this, and I don't think I would have known that if I hadn't, you know, tried.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to remember, that it can be in our head. And I like what Tara Moore says in Playing Big is like we're drawing at the whiteboard, in your safe little room or your creative cave. And it's like we actually have to get that message and idea out into the world, and then the message is going to shift and mold based on the feedback. It's not a one-way conversation.
Yeah, so be malleable, like be adaptable to that. I think always be willing to, like, you have your core principle, you have your value, that kind of thing, your North Star. But I think it's totally fine and in fact necessary to be willing to adjust all kinds of other things along the way, to get to that point, because, no plan survives contact with the battlefield, right? And the people who are successful are willing to adapt and shift and change.
And speaking of that adaptability, could you tell me, about a specific time, something you planned in your business and it didn't work out the way you expected? And really just like, how did you manage your expectations of the success that you thought it would be, and then, the setbacks?
Yeah, I mean, so many things. I think probably the biggest overall thing, it's not like a single moment of like business disaster or poor decisions. It's, there have been numerous times in this 10-year kind of period where, I have again looked at other people and said, wow, they've been so good at building structure around themselves, and they've got all these assistants, and they've got like this whole like entourage, like operation empire behind them. That's what I need, right? Because it obviously has worked for them. And I read this book that said I need somebody to be my outsourced assistant. So, I try to do that, and I've just failed at it over and over. And really, I'm not a good manager. And I finally just realized okay, yes, I probably could, devote time to becoming a better manager, but, am I going to be the greatest manager in the world? No, of course. And meanwhile, there are some other things that I'm a little bit good at. And, do I have to do everything the same way everybody else does? Of course not. In fact, whatever success I have has probably been because I haven't done it that way. And so there's been lots of times of where I think, okay, I have to build that structure, that entourage or whatever. And, it's never worked for me. And I tend to be much more successful when I'm doing most things on my own. And that's what I keep doing.
Yeah. So what does your team look like today?
I have one assistant, and she is great. She's wonderful. She's the only person who works with me full time. And then I have other people that work with me on a contract basis or a partnership basis, or in some way people I work with on the books with the publisher or with the podcast or with the WDS team. Obviously I'm not producing WDS all by myself. There's
right
behind that. Yeah. But they're all they're all either volunteers or part-time, kind of stipend paid.
Right. And seasonal because.
Yeah, exactly. We have this ramp up schedule, and then we kind of go and hibernate for a little bit before we regroup for the next one. So stuff like that has been much, much better for me. I've never had an office, where different employees come and work, and I just don't.
Yeah. And I think, you sharing that is just permission for anyone listening to not feel like they have to build an operation empire, which I love it.
Yeah. Right.
It really depends on the business model and how you want to show up and what are the skills and gifts that you want to express in the world. So I think that is just full permission.
Yeah, you got to do it your own way. You have to do it in a way that works for you, or else if for no other reason, just practically speaking, you're probably not going to be successful in doing something that you're not good at and not really motivated to do.
And I've heard you say, there's a part of you that enjoys doing a lot of the working in your own cave, right? You've got your podcast, it's solo, but having this, global audience online around the world, is there ever any times where you feel lonely in your business?
I feel lonely in my life, and my life and my business are the same.
Yeah.
So sure. But I guess I don't think, there's a lot we could say about that for another hour-long interview. I guess the short version is I don't think loneliness by itself is a bad thing.
Yeah.
Loneliness is a state of being. And, if you can appreciate, you can be lonely with people, right? You can be with somebody you love. You can be with a group of people and still feel lonely, or you can be by yourself and be perfectly content. So I think there's a lot more complexity to it than just, not being lonely.
Yeah. As I've noticed it for myself, in that building a business online, working on my laptop, it's there's, a lot of women that I work with feel a sense of isolation in their business, that they're kind of doing everything by themselves. And we actually need that community and that connection. And so it's a fascinating topic to me. I feel as we as social media increases, we're more connected than ever, but then we also feel disconnected as well.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's just a fascinating thing for me to watch. So I'm curious, are there ways that anything that you do to kind of disconnect, unplug from work? Like how do you turn off, or do you turn off?
Nope, I don't. I really don't. I'm sure, like I know I'm a contrarian, so I'm not telling anyone what to say. Like that's really important. Like I don't tell people what to do or what to think, or like you've got to figure it out for yourself. So I can just speak from my own experience, because I'm sure you have other guests that talk about doing your social media detox and all that kind of stuff, or whatever it is, like, going offline or not looking at your phone at different times. Like, I don't know. For me, I feel actually really connected, through what I do. And whenever the times that I feel I'm not motivated, I don't think the problem is because I'm using my phone too much or whatever the thing is. I think the problem is I'm doing the wrong things. And so I actually find that when I'm doing kind of work that is important to me and is hopefully making an impact on at least somebody out there, then that's actually energizing. It's not draining. It's not something I need to run away from or plan like blocks of my time around to protect, that kind of thing. But of course, everybody has to figure out their own stuff.
Yeah. So one question before we kind of close up, I would love to know, what is the vision that you're moving towards now? And what's, a question that people want to know is like, what's your why right now? What is really motivating you and getting you out of bed and moving you forward?
What is my why right now? Yeah, I mean, I guess the why is kind of like, okay, next stage, next level. What's happening? I mentioned that I started this whole Art of Nonconformity project when I turned 30. Well, at the time we're talking, I recently turned 40, right? I had that whole birthday. And so it obviously has gotten me thinking about when I turned 35, actually, to go to the middle point, that's when I finished going to every country in the world. And so, I think what's next is somewhat more of the same. Like I want to keep sharing. I want to keep doing what I'm doing. I want to deepen the connection. I want to have more impact. I want to always be open to new experiences and always be open to change, whether it's change in technology, whether it's change in how people are, interacting and encountering, engaging one another, engaging with the world. So I don't know if I have like a one sentence pithy, like here is my next project or whatever. It's just, I'm continuing to explore, in that vein, and I hope to keep challenging myself. I guess that's important. Like whatever I do, I want to make sure that it is challenging and different for me.
So good. So I want to sneak in one more question.
Of course.
I lied. One question that I get asked a lot, because I was just thinking about World Domination Summit and you're on your 8th year of it, which is amazing. A question that people ask me all the time is like, how do you get to speak on a stage like World Domination Summit? And I'm just curious, what would you say to someone if they wanted to speak on a stage like WDS? Like what is the path or the process to that, or are there certain things that you look for when you're looking for someone to speak on the WDS stage?
We look for people who are doing really interesting things. And for the most part, we look for people who aren't necessarily like raising their hand and saying like, I want to be a speaker. And that's not a bad thing. Like if somebody out there has that aspiration, but I tend to look at people who, we have like a blend of people who are kind of known and have a lot of profile and platform, and that's good. But then like some of our most popular speakers have been people who are kind of relatively unknown, and they were just doing something really different and kind of profoundly meaningful. And so nothing wrong with professional speaking or anything like that. But I guess to me, the more interesting question is like, what do you do? What do you do that justifies that? Like, what is the reason for that? Like, I think the wrong question to ask is like, how do I become a motivational speaker? It's like, if you're doing something that is profoundly motivational, right, is profoundly moving, then you talk about that basically, as opposed to like starting with the other perspective. I think there's a huge difference in those two, kind of ways of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's so profound that you shared that. And I appreciate you for truly, you're looking for unconventional speakers to share their message. And it was just such a gift, an opportunity to be able to share with your community in that way. And so for the listeners, just to be, that unconventional, like what is your mission? What is your message? What is that voice that you can't not share, and just start sharing it and people will notice. And that's where it happens. So I'll ask you now, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd love to share before we say goodbye?
This has been a wonderful conversation. So I'm very grateful to you. I don't think there's anything that I would add to it, except thank you again for asking me, and thanks to everyone who has listened thus far.
Thank you, Chris. We'll connect soon.
Awesome.
I hope you loved today's episode as much as I did. It is a pinch me moment to be able to have a thoughtful conversation with someone that I really look up to as far as the books that he has written that have inspired me to take imperfect action on my big ideas. So I have an invitation for you. If you are someone who has lots of ideas, is building a business, and wants support on prioritizing which ideas are worth implementing in your business, I would love to be your business mentor and to create a supportive community to support and encourage you along your entrepreneurial journey. Because if you are an entrepreneur, you know that we cannot do this thing alone. And so I created the Love Over Metrics Incubator. It is a business growth mastermind for women with big ambitions and even bigger hearts. So if that's you, I would love for you to get on the priority wait list. Go to loveovermetrics.com and you will be the first to know when you can start applying, because we are looking at applications very, very soon. Have an awesome day. Thank you so much for your heart and attention in listening to Lead with Love. If this message, leading with love in life and business, and remembering the humans and beating hearts behind the numbers and all of that good stuff, I would love for you to take the time to leave an honest review. It would mean the world to me, and it also helps more people find out about the goodness and helping spreading more love in the world, which we really, really need. So I would really appreciate that, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.